Hi, welcome to Naptime Nutrition. I'm Yaffi Lvova, registered dietitian, nutritionist, and owner of Baby Bloom Nutrition, Toddler Test Kitchen, and Naptime Nutrition. My most recent segment was with the fabulous Bracha Halberstadt, and we spoke about overcoming the thin ideal. And we got into a little bit about that with parenting. And today, my fabulous guest, Amelia Sherry, who's also a dietitian, is joining me to talk more about that and embracing healthy relationships with food and with your child. And Amelia specifically works with mothers and daughters. So welcome to Naptime Nutrition. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I love your energy. So thank you so much for having me here. Really.
I'll try to send some of it your way, but you're 3 hours ahead of me, so you should be 3 hours depleted.
Oh, thank you. I get a little break for end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So you work with primarily mothers and daughters about the food relationship and healthy relationship with food. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I focus on helping moms embrace healthy relationships with food so that their children can too. And often I focus on daughters as well because it just seems to come up a lot with food. Moms just seem to be focused more on their weight and how they're eating. And it's often because they've have a long history themselves of overemphasizing that part of their life.
Right. And that was a lot of what we got into with the last segment with Bracha. We were talking about how our bodies are so much a part of our personalities, and we potentially battle those bodies for years, for decades. And just when you think that you've overcome it and come to a healthy place, you have kids. And a lot of different areas of parenting just bring up a lot of triggers that can throw you right back into that body battle. And just like when you think that you've recovered, and even whether it's an eating disorder or disordered eating patterns or just body size obsession, which I think that most of the population has experience with some part of that. And so it's really important to remember that parenting can be super triggering when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a statistic 75% of women have suffered or have some sort of disordered eating. And I do think just living with so much diet culture, it does impact you second guess yourself with food all the time. And for some people like myself and many of the women that I work with, battling body and weight has just taken over way too much. Something I struggled with as a young woman and got under control in my 20s. And then just as you said, it kind of had a resurgence. First, every time our body changes, we a lot of us live sort of like restrained with our eating. We kind of have things under control. And then some sort of bomb gets set off, like, you get married, you move in with someone, you have pregnancy, or COVID happens and your structure gets thrown out the window and all those issues kind of creep back up. And when we have kids, not only pregnancy and body changes before, during, and after. But as we start to feed our children and they become more independent with food, those issues start to kind of bubble up again as well.
Right. Yeah. When we're really overcoming these thoughts, we learn how to focus on other more interesting areas of our lives. Because let's just say that talk about diet and body size is super boring, especially when many of us are such dynamic people. We have so much more to talk about, and that's just really kind of boring.
Yeah.
But
I think sorry to interrupt. I think it's a huge motivator for the mothers I work with. For me personally and other mothers, you just really just don't want. I have two daughters and a stepdaughter, and I just do not want them to waste any time worrying or thinking about these things. And it is related to weight. And then there's the other side of it, which is just healthy eating, which is also very stressful, depending on what your idea of that is. So yeah, I think that's a huge recognizing the waste it is, and just wanting to protect your daughter from it is a huge motivator.
yeah, it's such a good point, because we really spend so much energy, and that's mental real estate that's being taken up by a dumpster, basically, in your head. So let's just get past this, right? Let's learn to focus on other areas of our lives that are more interesting. But when you have a child, all of a sudden, throughout the pregnancy, you have to focus on your body and your changing body and what you're putting in your body. And I know for me, when I found out I was pregnant with twins, I ran straight to GNC and got a bunch of protein powder, which I never opened because it was not appealing, even in the canister. But you have that focus is brought back to food because you have to nourish yourself and your baby. In my case, and then when they're born and you have to breastfeed them or you have to bottle feed them, you have to think about that choice, and then you have to deal with other people's reactions to your choice, and then you have to do food introduction. Are you doing puree? Are you doing baby-led weaning? Are you doing some kind of combination? Everyone's going to have some kind of comment, and you are right back where you started with this intense focus on food. And now there's a better reason. It's a more productive reason to focus on food, but that can really bring back a lot of uncomfortable feelings and throw you back into that space. So where do you start with a mother and daughter or a mother and child pair?
Well, being a dietitian, we're taught to do an assessment first. So, I mean, I always start with, what is your goal? Why are you here? Thinking about the end in mind is important. And then we really have to suss out like what maybe is behind the problems. I mean, we start that is how we start with everyone. With regard to moms who have like a dieting history, and now maybe projecting it or feeling stress about their daughters, we have to really figure out like what's triggering for them. And a lot of it, as you know, is through, conversation and asking lots of questions. Often parents will come to me because they've been sent by their pediatrician because their child has gained weight. It's both sides of the spectrum. They've lost or gained weight, or not even gain weight, but just if they're at a high BMI. So that can be very triggering for a parent. And we have to, so, as a dietitian, we look at the growth charts and see actually if there is an issue. Sometimes even medical professionals, they are doing what they think is best and seeing a kid with a high BMI. But when we actually go and look at the child's growth chart and we see that they've been plotting where they have been on their curve since they were young, they're just a larger child, and there really is no reason to disrupt their eating habits at all. We can talk about what they're eating and if they're getting all the nutrients they need, but in terms of their weight, it may not even be an issue. So then it's sort of talking the mom or dad off the cliff about how can we become more accepting about it, and really, how can we also teach your daughter or your son to be accepting of themselves, especially now they're already feeling pressure from the outside when it's unnecessary. And sometimes there is a disruption we'll see the BMI take a steep jump, or a decline. And those deviations really teach us like we have to start to probe at that time and really see how the feeding relationship got off track. And to answer your first question, what I usually do when we're having all these conversations is I think about 3 bubbles. I think about just straight up nutrition, just nuts and bolts nutrition, like what they're actually taking in. I think about developmental stage, so where they're at and how they're going to react to food. An example is, when toddlers are starting to become really picky or becoming more independent, and that's an example. But of course, there are different things that happen very predictably with kids, during adolescence and teenage years. So that's an area. And then the third area is feeding dynamics. And often, it would be so easy if it was just a nutrition problem, they need more calcium or what have you. But very often that feeding dynamics, that relationship between that's my child's bedtime alarm going off. The dynamic with the parent is really, and the parent's approach to feeding is really where a lot of those issues come up. And that's how I actually ended up on this track focusing on moms who have a history or a complicated relationship with food, because that history does impact the dynamic, attitudes, fears, ability to give your children permission and the ability to learn how to eat on their own as opposed to telling them, and avoiding control. So
Yeah.
a lot.
So what all of this really comes back to is, as far as the feeding dynamic, is Ellen Satter's division of responsibility. And a lot of times now, with the growth in intuitive eating, people are asking me, should I be doing intuitive eating with my child? And so we chatted about this a little bit before we got on, just to make sure we were on the same page. But there are differences, and depending on your thought bubbles, like the thought bubbles that you mentioned, the nutrition and the developmental and everything, that's really going to direct you as far as the appropriate feeding dynamic. But when people ask about specifically intuitive eating for kids, what do you tell them?
I tell them that intuitive eating has a place, and that when we come to the table, really, intuitive eating primarily is about listening to signals from the body and giving yourself permission with food. And we want children to have that approach when they come to the table, but we don't want to explicitly teach children. They actually are born knowing how to be intuitive eater. What we really want to do is get out of their way and help preserve that. But with parenting, what we want to focus on is that structure. So yes, you want your child to be intuitive and to be in touch with their internal regulators, but at an appropriate time, so at the meal time. Whereas a woman who's sort of overcoming a dieting history may need to eat intuitively, give herself permission all day long, whenever she wants. That's not exactly, I don't recommend that for parents with feeding their child. They really need that structure. And actually for adults as well, structure, feeding yourself reliably at set intervals has shown in research to have so many benefits, including with regulation. So that the structure is sort of the missing element. What do you think?
I think the same thing. The thing is that to be an intuitive eater, and that's an adult being an intuitive eater, you have to have a certain basis of knowledge of your body, how it reacts to certain foods. You have to be able to make certain links that kids are just not advanced enough to make. And so we teach them how to make those links by following a structured plan. And that structured plan is eating, or the parent offers food every 2 to 3 hours. Some dietitians will go up to 4 hours with older kids. I generally work with younger kids, and I generally need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. So I just stick with that number myself. But offering food regularly at a predictable time in a predictable place, and offering whatever the parent is going to offer, and including a safe or often accepted food on the table. And that's just straight up division of responsibility. There are certain times when we do need to tweak division of responsibility for different situations. For example, a lot of kids who are neurodiverse do benefit from a schedule and predictability. But as far as is the kitchen open or closed between meals and how many options are on the table, that is something to discuss one-on-one with your feeding therapist in order to really make that appropriate for the family involved. Other than that, and a few other instances, division of responsibility is generally appropriate for most families. And so we like that model. And so an interesting thing is that, so you like the competent eater model, which is the adult model that Ellen Satter created. And we have kind of a choice between the competent eater model and the intuitive eating model. And they both have a lot of good stuff going for them. So we're not going to have an argument over which one's better. Chances are different models are better for different people. And so that's something that you can really get at by meeting with a dietitian one-on-one and to see what works best for your family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I like what you were saying about the difference in the 2 to 3 hours. It's such a great example of just being responsive to actually where your child's at and what they need, which is something that people with a dieting history have trouble with because we want those rigid rules. We don't trust ourselves. So we want, okay, is it 2 hours or 3 hours? And I don't know if you find that with parents, but they want you to tell them so specifically. And really what we're trying to do is help the parent be responsive and say, why don't we try 3 hours or 4? And if it's too long, then we need to know, to move it. But anyway, being responsive to yourself too as an eater is really important.
It's true. And it comes back to valuing your intuition. I mean, being an intuitive eater is not just what happens at the table. It's being able to trust yourself and being able to trust your gut instinct, because your gut instinct as a parent is really valid. Not for everything, but for should I feed my child right now or not? you can listen to your gut, and it's probably going to guide you in appropriate direction.
Right. And that's ultimately what we want to teach. I focus a lot on adolescent girls and moms because that's when a lot of issues come up when bodies are changing. But we want to teach that to our children too, to turn inward and look for that body wisdom with eating and with, many other aspects of life. But eating is a great example, not to turn outward, but to turn inward and see. And yes, the parent is going to choose what the offerings are, but then the child is going to use that intuitive ability to decide what's right for them from that point on.
Right. So with intuitive eating, the food, or with, sorry, with division of responsibility, I guess intuitive eating as well. The food that is on the table is what's available for the family, and they can have multiple helpings and all that. I mean, we could do hours and hours on division of responsibility, but I think something you mentioned that bears repeating or amplifying is that the table can be a microcosm of the rest of the world. And it's so easy to instill values at the table that child will draw on later in life. And so teaching them to look inward for answers as opposed to outward for all of the answers is really a valuable thing that you can teach your kids at the table. And that will carry over into other aspects of their life and be really valuable as they grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many things happen at the table. So many lessons are learned, not just, we know also from research, those family meals, which goes back to structure, are just so important. Not just to better nutrient intake, but so many other aspects of our social and emotional development for our children. Having that face time with you, having that attention. And it just so happens that it's around food, which it can sometimes actually be complicated. And that's why we don't want it to be fraught with, shoulds and do's and don'ts and all those complicated things that can come up for people.
It's really true. And my tagline that I say all the time is make laughter your mealtime soundtrack, because it's not about the food. It's about the laughter. It's about counting smiles, not counting bites. It's about relating to each other in a kind and respectful way over food. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really where it all starts. And there is a wealth of research on the benefits of having the family meal. I mean, as you mentioned, not only the nutrients, but there's a lower incidence of depression and anxiety among kids who have family meals. There's a lower incidence of suicide attempts, a lower incidence of body dissatisfaction, higher grades, possibly higher IQ. I don't remember if that one was officially on the list or not, but better performance in school and then later on as well, because they use that time, that connection that you mentioned, to build confidence. And that confidence really just carries over into so many aspects of their life. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the number one thing we can really give our kids, is the knowledge that their intuition is valuable. And we have to sometimes, as parents, we question ourselves. And sometimes we have to fake it till we make it, right? Like sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we don't feel confident in parenting. Maybe I should say sometimes we do feel confident in parenting. But we have to say, you know what? I know I'm doing the best thing for my child right now, and I'm going to be confident in that, because we need that confidence too.
Yeah. That mealtime, one of the things, I don't know if you find this as well, but so often parents come in and they just have so much noise in their head about foods and nutrition, and they have these very sort of high level questions, like, is it okay? Is this milk okay? But like coming back down to that real base, and like turns out they're not making time to eat with their kids. And
Yeah.
there's some really basic things that matter so much more, I think, to long-term health. I don't think, I know, we know it from research, and having those regular meals to whatever extent you can. I know that it isn't always possible. It gives so many benefits, physical, emotional, and social. So yeah, sometimes eating is a lot more simple than or nutrition, I should say. It's a lot more simple than we think it has to be. Yeah.
Yes, it is much more simple. And the thing is that the society doesn't really get that message, because everyone gets the message that, one day the egg is good, the next day egg is bad, and the next day egg is good. And the thing is that the research doesn't change. It's the headlines that change, but dietitians are not really in charge of those headlines.
Mhm.
And so when things in nutrition seem like they're giving you medical whiplash because we go back and forth so much, it's not really the medical establishment going back and forth. It's not dietitians going back and forth. It's the news, because they're trying to grab your attention. It doesn't really have basis in actual research. They take the smallest amount of research and blow it up so that you click on the story, because that's how they make money. There really is not that much drama as far as whether eggs are good for you or bad for you. And yeah, all foods fit anyway, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we're usually doing a lot of damage control. But the good news is that if you have a developmentally normal or healthy child, that you really don't need to worry if you're able to provide food, a variety of foods and that contact in those meal times. You don't need to worry about the nutrition as much as are led to believe. Of course, if there's a food allergy or celiac or type 1 or different things, then we want to pay more attention. But outside of those things, most of us are very fortunate, and we don't need to worry about it as much as we're led to believe. The headlines make us believe, I should say.
Yes, we really are. We really are led to believe a whole lot by society. I was talking to a mom just this morning about protein and how much protein you need. And I mean, you've got advice out there about having 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, which is very much in excess of what the research tells. I mean, that's not what we learn at all, but that's what's in these magazines, and that's what these parents are reading. And so what do you do? It's very, very common for parents to be concerned about their child's weight. And unfortunately, a lot of times pediatricians are not really on the dietitian's side or on the same side as the dietitian in this argument. And I know that you work with that a lot. So how do you approach that question?
We talked a little before about looking at the growth chart and really seeing if there has been a disruption. A lot of times it is reassuring the parent that it can be very difficult, because if a doctor, especially one you've trusted for a long time, or if you're, actually coming to see a specialist, tells you that the weight is an issue, it can be difficult to counter that. They're an authority, now you're contradicting, you don't really want to do that. But often showing the parent the growth chart and just seeing that they, no one said anything about it when it was, your child's BMI was here, and why is it a problem now, can be, reassuring in some cases not appropriate. I always focus on habits and explain that I always say we focus on habits, not habitus. Like, what your child is doing day in and day out, we're going to impact your child's health much more significantly than whether or not we can inch that scale one way or the other. So we're not going to focus on weight. And some parents really aren't actually comfortable with that at all, because it's been so drilled in them. So there could be a lot of education going on. Sometimes the parents just worried about their weight because there's a lot of weight stigma, weight bias out there, and there's a lot of that puts so much pressure on our eating. And we don't want that. So I'll explain that. I think I had said before too, if your child is in a larger body, what we really need to do is practice acceptance and help your child understand how healthy and normal they are for them. So it really depends on whether we're, working on a change. Like a lot of things do happen to BMI based on changes. We were talking about for women, changes that disrupt eating, but for kids, a new school, a pandemic, the divorce, so things do impact, and we have to find out. It's usually something like that. It's not that, oh, my child's been taking too big portions. There's usually a lot of an underlying issue that we need to address, as opposed to now just enforcing restriction, something like that. It's complicated. And then I actually work in pediatric endocrinology, so we see a lot of kids with metabolic dysfunction, sometimes related to their weight, sometimes incorrectly associated. But I do a lot of education for pediatric providers, explaining to them the importance of not focusing on weight and the negative impacts of weight stigma, which can be far worse than the actual weight the child may or may not have put on recently. There's a lot of research behind that as well. And it's difficult. It's a huge paradigm shift to not focus on losing weight, especially in areas like endocrinology. So being understanding too of where the person has coming from, the provider, how difficult it might be for them to understand, is always good. And we were talking about that before with our own mothers coming, maybe putting pressure on our eating because of concern, different reasons, but understanding where they were coming from instead of just saying, no, that's wrong. I had experience with my mother putting pressure on me to maintain a certain weight. And it's because she thought that's how I would, get somewhere in the world if I was a certain body weight and looked the same way, but she didn't mean it in a cruel way. So just understanding where the other person is coming from can be really helpful too.
That is really helpful because in previous generations, we had previous knowledge and we had previous ways of thinking. And it's interesting because if you take that same idea of looking to the past, we can look to the past in different countries and in different places around the world, at different times across history, and the ideal woman's body was different sizes. And now, of course, we have a lot more research. What we're not saying is weight is not an issue. What we're saying is weight is a symptom more than it's a problem. And so when it's seen as a problem, then losing weight is the solution. And instead of looking at it that way, we're looking at it as weight may or may not indicate an underlying problem, either psychologically or physically, lots of different layers. But when we look at the number on the scale and use that to determine health, it's limiting in so many ways. And so that's not the most effective way toward health. So you mentioned a couple of words that I'm not sure our audience is familiar with: weight stigma and weight bias. So can you talk a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. Weight stigma is, well, from being in the working in a clinical environment, there's a lot of, well, it's not just in the clinical environment, but it's when we associate negative attributes to someone based on them being a higher body weight. We may, you know, there are negative consequences to that for the person who feels stigmatized. For instance, if you're a parent in a larger body or a parent in a smaller body with a child in a larger body, you may avoid medical attention or seeking out the pediatrician's advice because you know that pediatrician, or you may feel stigmatized in the sense that that person's going to look at you and assume that you're not a great feeder or not a good parent because your child simply is in a larger body, which in many cases is nothing to that's their natural weight. That's who they are. We don't know. So it has a lot of damaging effects. There's research that shows people in larger bodies who feel stigmatized may not enjoy physical activity as much because they're very self-conscious. They might not engage in healthcare. They might not engage in other healthy habits because the way they may feel that there is no hope or that they can't be a healthy person at their body size. Weight bias is very similar. Weight bias is, and you can add to this definition as well. I'm thinking about even nutritionists, we're all coming with a certain sense of biases when we walk into a situation with a patient. And we really need to start, I try very hard to check them at the door. And I try to neutralize, just even being aware of them is just so important. But I try to neutralize those things with parents all the time, especially with food. They'll say things like, "Oh, I'm so bad. We had McDonald's yesterday." I say, "Oh, McDonald's is, sometimes really helpful when you're in a rush. Sometimes you have to do that, and that's great. I'm so happy you fed your child. I'm so happy you made time to give them dinner." Something like that can sort of show that you're not coming at it with all this baggage already. What do you think? Do you?
Yeah. There has been a lot of research recently on how many medical diagnoses get missed. Many medical obstacles get missed just because either someone has put off going to the doctor because they think it'll be blamed on their weight, or because it is blamed on their weight and the actual underlying diagnosis is missed. And people are dying because of that. But even less dramatic, people are just afraid to go to the doctor. And it's very sad. And I mean, as a dietitian, we hear all the time, "Oh, I'm so bad. Don't look at what I'm eating." I'm not judging you. You know what? Food is food. And if you can get comfortable with yourself, then you'll make the choices that are appropriate for you. And it's not up to me to determine what those are, especially if you're not a client of mine. If you're just sitting across from me at a party, I'm certainly not judging you.
Yeah, I know people, that is one negative about being a dietitian, or people always get really self-conscious about eating. And it's helpful if I could just eat some of whatever they're eating as well, whatever they think is not so great. But neutralizing those negative attitudes towards food is also really important. Not having those, this is a virtuous food and this is a bad food, especially for children, because we make judgments about who that child is, when we say, "Oh, this food is bad. And, what is your child now thinking about themselves if they enjoy that food, or if a child next to them at school is eating something that you've deemed, not appropriate. So we have to be aware of how we're putting those, I guess, bias and stigma on different foods as well, and try to neutralize that, so that, again, you're coming, especially with kids and adults, coming to the table feeling confident and secure, and like, I'm good at this. I'm a good eater. These foods are okay. I know how to nourish myself. Like, that is like just one of the most important parts of being a healthy eater, and we kind of overlook that a lot. We damage it a lot, I think, with all of these
Yeah.
different ideas.
We really do. And there's this whole idea out there of food as medicine. And when Hippocrates first said that, it was a very different time. And so food can be medicine to some extent. For example, if you're low in calcium, have more calcium, that's then maybe food is medicine. Maybe you were having easy breaking bones before, and you can overcome that by changing the diet. But there are these instances are very rare, and most of the time you need a multifactorial approach, multi-professional approach, in order to overcome a health obstacle. It doesn't come down just to food, because where that goes in the domino chain of life is food is the cause and or the cure for everything. And that's not real. It puts too much pressure on our relationship with our body and our relationship with our food choices. And when we're raising kids, it then puts that pressure on them as well. And they're not old enough to take on that nuance and to understand exactly what healthy eating is. And to come back to the beginning of the conversation, just as we think about different factors when we're seeing a client, we think about the different aspects. We also must think about different aspects of health when we talk about health. It's not just physical, it's emotional, it's mental, it's community, it's spiritual. There are many layers to health. And when we focus on just the physical, we miss out on so much good in life.
Absolutely. I talk about that a lot in my writing, and the definition from the World Health Organization of health is total physical, emotional, and social well-being. So we don't want to. We have a tendency, and that's when we get in this conflict with medical providers sometimes. Yes, it's their job to focus on your physical health, but when you come to the nutritionist and we're looking at you holistically, we do not want to change your eating in a way that now, negatively impacts your emotional health or your social health. You're not able to go out or enjoy a social situation because you're so worried about eating. So we don't want to say that the physical health isn't important, but we need to approach it in a way that takes into account the other aspects of your health,
Yeah.
And eating is just a microcosm of, it's just got everything going on, right? It's got
Yes.
social, yeah.
It's everything. And that's why we have so many issues with food. It's because it hits every sense. It hits every aspect of health. It hits every aspect of culture. It's just, and it happens 3 to 6 times a day. And so we need to have a good relationship with it, and we need to pass on a good relationship with it, because it's happening all the time. I mean, this is a major part of our day, is nourishing ourselves. And so it's best to have a healthy relationship with food. So what is the number one tip that you can give parents, specifically mothers raising daughters, in order to encourage a healthy relationship with food on both sides of that dyad?
I would say that understanding eating competence, that's a big word that probably isn't that easy to just throw out there, but basically getting into a healthy place with your own relationship with food, and just being aware and checking whatever your issues are. The more eating, research shows that eating competent parents raise children with higher levels of eating competence themselves, and eating competence is associated with a huge laundry list of benefits, health and social, emotional benefits. So basically, understanding what your attitudes, which can be kind of hidden and tricky, they can be communicated just in tone, and your feelings, your hangups with food, what your real concerns are, and what your real goal is for your daughter, are some of the most important things, I think, that you can do. And we didn't talk, we just hit on it before, but the way, if you you are impacting your relationship with your daughter and all of your children when you second guess or put pressure on them with eating. You know, it does create a negative, I don't know the words to use right now, but I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. And you don't want to transmit that or destroy that trust between your daughter and yourself because of these issues that really might not be as important in the long run, as we were saying earlier, as we may think in the moment.
Yeah.
So,
So
I think sorry, go ahead.
an exercise I heard that I really like to encourage people to do is to think, if you're dealing with a mother and daughter, specifically think about women who are influential and powerful in the world and list all the things that you really love about them. And you might notice that their weight is probably not on that list.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Definitely. That's another thing, that if your daughter is verbalizing to you concerns about her weight or her looks, really, it's really important. I know the instinct is to say, "Oh no, you're beautiful," or "No, you're not fat," but we really have to avoid doing that and really open things up, and be curious about where that's coming from, so that we can diffuse it in a much more powerful way, pointing out all of the things that do matter, for instance, and understanding why they're, feeling negatively about themselves. Because if you just say, "Oh, no, you're not," which is what I got a lot from my mother, you're not really addressing the underlying problem at all, and you're not helping your daughter. So you really want to get curious and ask more questions. And do point out all the things like you just said, all how little this actually would matter. What's the cost of really focusing on this, and what's the benefit too,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you have questions about nutrition for your kids or for yourself, or if you're just in an uncomfortable place reliving some past food issues, you deserve to get hope. You deserve to feel confident. And particularly right now, their insurance has really opened up as far as how much counseling will be covered. Just because of everything that we've been through in 2020, and I know that's persisted to 2021. And so if you're going through this, check with your insurance, because you might be completely covered. You might be able to handle this issue with the appropriate professional for little to nothing out of pocket. And wouldn't that be so nice?
Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
So Amelia, where can people find you?
They can find me on, I have a website called nourisher.com, which is 2 H's. So it's Nourish Her. And you can also find me on Instagram, which is just Amelia Sherry RD. And I'd love to connect with people if anyone's interested in talking about building their own eating competence or that of their kids. I'd love to connect, and I answer questions on there all the time. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me, Amelia. This is great. And it's definitely something that it's a little bit above the age range that I usually focus on. So I really appreciate your expertise here.
Oh, thanks for listening. That's great.
Yeah. And if anyone has had an issue where their child comes home and says, "Mommy, I'm fat," I do have an Naptime Nutrition where I interviewed Sivi Pill, who she's an MSW focusing on pediatric eating disorders. So go check that one out. And I do plan to do a segment also on what to do if your child is being bullied about their weight. So that's coming. Stay tuned. Thank you so much, everyone. And I will be here next time. I couldn't tell you when that is, but Naptime Nutrition, naptimenutrition.com. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Amelia.
You're welcome. Be well.
You too.